In 2019, protesters swarmed Brussels streets, hammering a bronze statue with sledgehammers. The crowd screamed, "Murderer! Racist!" as metal crashed to the ground. But here's what will blow your mind. Just 100 years earlier, this same man was hailed by the entire world as Europe's greatest humanitarian. So what's the truth? Was Leopold II of Belgium a saint or a psychopath? The answer will make you understand why they don't teach this in schools, why universities actively discourage research on this topic, and why today the Belgian government fights court cases to suppress this story. Because what Leopold II did in the Congo makes Hitler look like an amateur. We're talking about millions of victims, more than the Holocaust, Armenian genocide, and Rwandan genocide combined, over 23 years, and unlike those atrocities, Leopold operated with complete international approval. Today, I'm going to show you documented evidence of the most successful cover-up in human history. Crimes so thoroughly erased from memory that the victims don't even have descendants to demand justice. This is the story they spent 100 years trying to bury, but the evidence survived. Meet Leopold II of Belgium. In 1885, newspapers called him the most charitable king in Europe. The New York Times praised his noble humanitarian mission. Standing before the Berlin Conference in 1885, Leopold delivered a speech that moved world leaders to tears. "I want to open the door of civilization to the dark continent of Africa." 14 world powers unanimously voted to hand Leopold control over the Congo Free State. Not to Belgium, to Leopold personally, as his private property. An area of 2.3 million square kilometers, 80 times larger than Belgium itself, packed with ivory, rubber, and gold. The world believed Leopold would end the Arab slave trade in Africa. They believed he was different from other colonial powers because his mission was purely humanitarian. They were about to discover how wrong they were. Leopold didn't just fool the world once. He kept fooling them for 23 years. While millions died, European newspapers continued printing stories about his civilizing mission. While villages burned and children were mutilated, international conferences praised his humanitarian progress. How did one man convince the entire world that mass murder was humanitarian work? The first crack in Leopold's facade appeared in 1901 at a shipping dock in Antwerp, Belgium. A 28-year-old shipping clerk named Edmund Morel noticed something that didn't make sense. Every month, massive steamships arrived from the Congo loaded with rubber and ivory, tons of it. But when Morel checked the manifests of ships heading to the Congo, he found something disturbing. No trade goods, no manufactured items, no money changing hands. Just guns, ammunition, chains, explosives. According to basic economics, this was impossible. Where were the European goods being traded for all that rubber and ivory? Then it hit him. There was no trade. There was no payment. This wasn't commerce. This was armed robbery on a continental scale. Morel realized that everything Europe believed about Leopold's humanitarian mission was a lie. The rubber wasn't being bought. It was being stolen. Those guns and chains weren't being used to fight Arab slavers. They were being used to enslave the Congolese themselves. But Morel had no idea how deep the horror really went. He didn't know about the quotas. He didn't know about the hand-cutting. He didn't know that Leopold had turned human suffering into a mathematical formula for maximum profit. And he had no idea that thousands of miles away, a brave missionary with a camera was about to document evidence that would change the course of human rights forever. But the true scale of Leopold's crimes would only be exposed when one courageous photographer decided to document what she witnessed in the heart of the Congo rainforest. The photograph she took would become the first evidence of genocide in history. It would shock the world, topple a king, and establish the power of visual evidence to demand justice. What you're about to see is an image so powerful, so devastating, that it's still difficult to look at 120 years later. It's the photograph that proved Edmund Morel right. It's the photograph that revealed Leopold's humanitarian mission was actually the most sophisticated killing machine in human history. And it starts with a father named Nsala, sitting in his village, staring at something in his hands that no parent should ever have to hold. This is Alice's story. This is Nsala's story. This is the story they never wanted you to hear. Her name was Alice Seeley Harris, 28 years old, married to a missionary, and she had just arrived in the Congo with what she believed was a noble mission, to help the native people that King Leopold was civilizing. Alice was different from most missionaries of her time. She carried something revolutionary, a camera. In 1904, photography in the Congo was almost unheard of. But Alice had a different vision. She wanted to document the progress that Leopold's humanitarian mission was bringing to Africa. She planned to take photographs of happy villages, thriving communities, and the wonderful transformation that European civilization was supposedly creating. Like most people in 1904, Alice genuinely believed King Leopold's propaganda. She thought she was joining a humanitarian effort that would help lift an entire people out of poverty and ignorance. She had no idea she was about to document the most organized genocide in human history. What Alice witnessed in the Congo would shatter her faith in European civilization forever. The photographs she took would become the first visual evidence of genocide ever recorded. On May 14th, 1904, Alice traveled to a village called Wala in the Nsongo district. She brought her camera, expecting to photograph what Leopold's administrators called local customs and daily life. Instead, she found a man sitting motionless outside his hut, staring at something in his hands. His name was Nsala. He was a father, a rubber collector, and by all accounts, a hard-working man who simply wanted to provide for his family. But as Alice approached him, she realized something was terribly wrong. Nsala wasn't moving. He wasn't speaking. He was just staring down at objects in his hands with a look of absolute devastation. When Alice got closer, she saw what Nsala was holding. A tiny hand and a tiny foot. They belonged to his 5-year-old daughter, Bawali. Alice later wrote in her diary that the smell hit her first, the sickly sweet odor of death that she would never forget. Then came the story that the local missionary, Edgar Stannard, told her through an interpreter. Nsala had failed to meet his rubber quota that week. Every adult male in the Congo was required to collect exactly 4 kilograms of dried rubber every 2 weeks. No exceptions, no excuses. But the rubber trees around Nsala's village had been nearly depleted. To find enough latex-producing vines, he would have had to walk over 200 kilometers into the deep forest. When Nsala returned with only 3 kilograms, the company guards delivered their message. They shot his wife, they shot his son, and they chopped off his 5-year-old daughter's hand and foot while she was still alive, letting her bleed to death as a warning to other villagers. Then they made Nsala carry the severed pieces back to his village as proof of their authority. As Alice listened to this story, she realized it wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't the work of a few rogue soldiers or a local commander who had lost his mind. Here was policy. Here was the machine. Here was how the Belgian king's humanitarian mission actually operated. The math was brutal. Every adult male in the Congo Free State had to deliver 4 kilograms of dried rubber every 2 weeks. Miss your quota, and your family became hostages. Miss it again, and they started cutting off hands and feet. But here's the truly diabolical part. The quotas were deliberately impossible to meet. The Belgian monarch's administrators had calculated exactly how much rubber was available in each region. They knew that the trees were being depleted. They knew that 4 kilograms every 2 weeks was mathematically impossible for most villages. And that was the point. The operation wasn't designed to collect rubber efficiently. It was designed to terrorize the population into absolute submission while extracting maximum profit. Alice learned that the Belgian soldiers, the Force Publique, were paid bonuses for every severed hand they collected. 2 francs per hand. They carried wicker baskets to collect their grisly trophies. The local commander had instituted a quota for his soldiers too. 1 severed hand for every bullet fired. This ensured that every bullet had to kill a Congolese person, and every death had to be proven with a severed hand. Standing there in that village, looking at Nsala holding the remains of his daughter, Alice Seeley Harris made a decision that would change the course of human rights history. She was going to document everything. Alice realized that King Leopold's greatest weapon wasn't his army, it was information control. The world believed his propaganda because no one had ever seen evidence of what was really happening in the Congo. She was going to change that. Over the next 4 years, Alice would take over 300 photographs documenting the king's apparatus of terror. Children with their hands chopped off, men and women chained together in forced labor gangs, mass graves, burned villages. She photographed everything, even when the images made her physically sick. She interviewed hundreds of survivors. She collected testimonies. But Alice didn't yet understand the full scope of what she was exposing. She didn't know that Nsala's story was just one of millions. She didn't know that the Belgian king had turned the entire Congo into a corporate death machine designed to extract maximum profit from human suffering. Here was the story of an entire nation being deliberately murdered for rubber. What emerged was something much more sinister: the birth of corporate genocide, where human lives became nothing more than entries in a profit and loss ledger. Because the king had designed his operation with mathematical precision. He had calculated exactly how many people needed to die to maximize rubber production. He had created incentive structures that rewarded mass murder. The machine that Alice was about to expose in all its horrifying detail. Here's what Alice Harris didn't understand when she first arrived in the Congo. The territory wasn't a Belgian colony. It wasn't even a normal European colonial enterprise. The Congo Free State was the Belgian monarch's private corporation. A business, with shareholders, profit margins, and quarterly reports filed in Brussels boardrooms. And like any business, it was designed around a simple equation: maximize revenue, minimize costs, optimize efficiency. The numbers were staggering. The Anglo-Belgian India Rubber Company purchased raw rubber from Congolese collectors for 0.25 francs per kilogram. They sold that same rubber on European markets for 10 francs per kilogram. That's a 4,000% markup. For every franc invested in collecting rubber, the Belgian monarch's companies made 40 francs in profit. But here's the key detail that makes the arrangement so sinister. There were no costs for labor because there were no wages. The Congolese weren't employees. They were unpaid prisoners forced to harvest rubber at gunpoint. The only significant expenses were guns, ammunition, and the salaries of European overseers. The Belgian monarch kept the richest territory, a region called the Crown Domain, covering 250,000 square kilometers, as his personal property. During the rubber boom, the king personally extracted 70 million francs from the territory. In today's money, that's approximately $2.8 billion. It wasn't colonialism. Here was the world's first corporate mass murder. But how do you force an entire population to work without pay? How do you maintain an operation where missing your rubber quota means death? You build an army. The Belgian king's army was called the Force Publique. 19,000 African soldiers commanded by 380 European officers. It wasn't a normal military force. Here was a terror organization designed specifically to implement crimes against humanity. Boys as young as 10 were kidnapped from their villages and forced into military service. They were deliberately stationed far from their home regions so they wouldn't recognize the people they were ordered to brutalize. They were given European names, European uniforms, and European weapons. Their own cultures and identities were methodically erased. They were turned into instruments of the Belgian king's will. The primary weapon wasn't guns. It was psychological terror. The chicotte, a whip made from dried hippopotamus hide, could kill a person with 25 lashes. But the chicotte was merciful compared to the hand-cutting operation. Every bullet fired by a Force Publique soldier had to be accounted for with a severed human hand. This prevented soldiers from using ammunition for hunting. Every shot had to kill a Congolese person, and every killing had to be proven. Soldiers carried wicker baskets to collect hands during village raids. They received bonus payments, 2 francs per hand. The operation's brutality is impossible to understand without hearing from the people who survived it. Epondo, a 15-year-old boy, testified to British consul Roger Casement about the day soldiers came to his village. His father had collected only 3 kilograms of rubber instead of the required 4. The sentence was immediate. They chopped off Epondo's left hand with a machete and told him to carry the hand back to his village as a warning to others. Epondo survived. He was one of the lucky ones. Matuli of Ikoko, a 15-year-old girl, watched soldiers shoot her father while she hid in the forest. When they found her mother hiding in their house, they chopped off both her hands while she was still alive, then decapitated her 2 days later. Matuli watched it all. When a Danish missionary asked a force publique soldier to explain the hand-cutting operation, the soldier's response revealed the psychological manipulation. "Don't take this to heart so much. They kill us if we don't bring the rubber. The commissioner has promised us if we have plenty of hands, he will shorten our service." Even the soldiers were victims of the Belgian king's machine, forced to choose between committing atrocities or facing execution themselves. These weren't isolated incidents. These weren't the actions of a few sadistic commanders. These were standard operating procedures, documented, organized, reported to Brussels in quarterly company reports filed alongside profit and loss statements. For 23 years, the operation ran with ruthless efficiency across an area larger than Western Europe, village by village, quota by quota, hand by hand. The question that Alice Harris was about to answer, the question that would shock the world and bring down a king, was simple. How many people died in the Belgian monarch's corporate death machine? The number I'm about to show you is why the Belgian government ordered the destruction of every document in 1906. Why they classified information for over 100 years. Why even today, Belgian schools barely mention the monarch's role in Central Africa. Because when you see the true scale of these atrocities, you'll understand why they make the Holocaust look small by comparison. The death toll was staggering. The death toll was catastrophic. That's the number that haunted Alice Harris for the rest of her life. That's the number that Belgian officials spent 100 years trying to suppress. But let's start with the methodology, because these aren't wild estimates thrown around by activists. Here is careful demographic research conducted by professional historians using multiple lines of evidence. Adam Hochschild, author of King Leopold's Ghost, spent 8 years in archives across 3 continents. He examined genealogies maintained by Congolese families, oral traditions, police records, and surviving administrative papers. His conclusion: 10 million excess deaths during the Belgian monarch's reign. Jan van Sina, who spent 50 years studying Central African history, reached similar conclusions through linguistic analysis and oral history collection. His estimate: 5 to 10 million deaths. But here's what every researcher agrees on. Even the lowest estimates represent organized mass murder. Even conservative figures of 1.2 million mean the deliberate extermination of over 1 million human beings for corporate profit. The most compelling evidence comes from the Belgian government's own census data. In 1924, 16 years after the Belgian king lost control of the territory, Belgian administrators found approximately 10 million people living in the entire region. But pre-colonial population estimates suggest the region supported between 16 and 20 million people before the Belgian king's arrival in 1885. Do the math. A population decline from 20 million to 10 million represents a 50% demographic collapse in just 23 years. That's not natural population fluctuation. That's deliberate extermination. Let me put this in perspective for you, because numbers this large become abstract unless you understand the scale. The Holocaust killed approximately 6 million Jews over 12 years. The Armenian Genocide killed approximately 1.5 million people. The Rwandan Genocide killed 800,000 people in 100 days. The Cambodian Genocide under Pol Pot killed approximately 2 million people over 4 years. The Belgian monarch's Central African atrocities killed more people than the Holocaust. Armenian Genocide, Rwandan Genocide, and Cambodian Genocide combined, and lasted longer than any of them. But here's the statistic that should make you angry. Major newspapers publish an average of 3,847 articles per year mentioning the Holocaust. Articles about the Belgian king's Central African crimes? 23 per year. 23 articles about millions of dead Africans. Nearly 4,000 articles about 6 million dead Europeans. It isn't an accident. Here is deliberate memory suppression. Here is institutional racism baked into how we remember history. Now here's something that will shock you. Direct violence accounted for less than 5% of the deaths in the Belgian territory. Most people didn't die from bullets or machetes or torture. They died from the indirect consequences of the king's apparatus. In 1901 alone, 500,000 people died from sleeping sickness, a disease spread by tsetse flies that proliferated when forced population movements disrupted traditional settlement patterns. When the Belgian soldiers drove people from their villages to collect rubber, they created perfect breeding conditions for disease vectors. Forced migration spread smallpox, dysentery, and influenza across vast distances. Populations that had lived in isolated communities for centuries were suddenly thrown together in labor camps, creating epidemic conditions that killed hundreds of thousands. Starvation was deliberate and methodical. When every adult male in a village was forced to spend 2 weeks collecting rubber, there was no one left to plant crops, tend livestock, or hunt game. Food production collapsed across entire regions. The birth rate plummeted by approximately 60% during the Belgian monarch's reign. Women suffering from malnutrition couldn't carry pregnancies to term. Children born into the apparatus died from diseases that would have been survivable under normal conditions. It wasn't accidental demographic change. Here was what modern social scientists call social death, the deliberate destruction of the social, economic, and cultural structures that allow human communities to survive and reproduce. The geographic scope of devastation is almost impossible to comprehend. Roger Casement traveled thousands of miles through the territory and reported entire regions where human habitation had simply ceased to exist. His exact words: "Whole districts have been depopulated. Villages that once held 2,000 people now contain fewer than 50. In some areas, we found only bones." The Mongala province lost approximately 90% of its population. The Equateur province lost 75%. The Lake Tomba region, once one of the most densely populated areas in Central Africa, was almost completely abandoned. Languages that had been spoken for centuries simply disappeared. Not because people chose to abandon them, but because there were no longer enough speakers alive to maintain them. Entire cultures, accumulated over millennia, were erased in a single generation. Here is what millions of deaths looks like when you map it geographically. Not a number, not a statistic. An entire civilization methodically erased from the earth. And the world was about to find out about it, thanks to heroes who refused to let the Belgian king's crimes remain hidden in the African darkness. Remember Edmund Morel, the shipping clerk who first noticed something wrong with the cargo manifests in Antwerp? By 1903, this ordinary 28-year-old man had made the most dangerous decision of his life. He was going to take on a king. Morel earned £120 per year, barely enough to support his wife and children. He had no political connections, no wealthy backers, no institutional support. What he had was shipping records that proved the Belgian king was lying to the world, and a moral conviction that wasn't worth staying silent about genocide. In 1903, Morel quit his job and founded the Congo Reform Association. He used his life savings to rent a small office in Liverpool and started publishing a newsletter called West African Mail. His goal was simple: expose the Belgian monarch's crimes using hard evidence. But Morel understood something that modern activists often miss. Evidence without audience is worthless. He needed celebrities, politicians, and public figures to amplify his message. Mark Twain responded with King Leopold's Soliloquy, a devastating monologue written from the Belgian monarch's perspective that sold hundreds of thousands of copies across America. Twain's character brags about fooling the world while murdering millions. The good work goes on. Ship them to the good king's rubber plantations. Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, wrote The Crime of the Congo, a factual exposé that became an international bestseller. Doyle's detective skills proved devastating when applied to Belgian propaganda. Joseph Conrad, who had worked as a steamboat captain in Central Africa, wrote Heart of Darkness, a fictional account that captured the psychological horror better than any factual report. Within 2 years, Morel had transformed reform from a fringe cause into an international movement. But Morel's greatest weapon wasn't celebrity endorsement. It was documentation. He collected shipping records, missionary reports, company financial statements, survivor testimonies. He built an airtight case that even the Belgian king's propaganda machine couldn't refute. While Morel was building public pressure, the British government was facing uncomfortable questions about their recognition of the Belgian regime. In 1903, Foreign Secretary Lord Lansdowne made a decision that would change everything. He would send an official investigator to Central Africa. The man chosen for the mission was Roger Casement, British consul at Boma. Casement was an experienced colonial administrator, fluent in multiple African languages, and known for his meticulous attention to detail. What the Belgian king didn't realize was that Casement was also a man with a conscience. For 4 months, Casement traveled through the territory, interviewing survivors, photographing evidence, and documenting atrocities with the methodical precision of a criminal prosecutor. The result was the Casement Report, 40 pages of devastating evidence published as an official British parliamentary paper in 1904. Unlike missionary accounts or activist claims, here was an official government document that no one could dismiss as biased propaganda. Casement's report included testimonies we've already heard: Epondo's severed hand, Matuli's murdered parents, but also hundreds of other documented cases, village after village, atrocity after atrocity. The international reaction was immediate and explosive. Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey told Parliament, "No external question for at least 30 years has moved the country so strongly and so vehemently." The United States Congress passed resolutions condemning the Congo Free State. Germany and France began distancing themselves from the Belgian monarch. Even Belgium's own parliament started asking uncomfortable questions. Casement had done something unprecedented. He had used official diplomatic channels to expose genocide in real time. While Morel built public support and Casement provided official documentation, Alice Harris was revolutionizing human rights advocacy through visual evidence. Between 1905 and 1908, the missionary organized over 200 lantern slideshows across Britain and the United States. These weren't academic lectures. They were visceral, emotional experiences that brought Central African atrocities directly into church halls and community centers. Harris would dim the lights and project her photographs onto large screens while narrating the stories behind each image. Audiences saw Nsala holding his daughter's severed hand. They saw children with amputated limbs. They saw mass graves and burned villages. Over 100,000 people attended the photographer's presentations in person. Millions more read newspaper accounts of her shows. For the first time in history, genocide was being documented and disseminated through photography. The missionary had invented something entirely new: the Human Rights Photography Campaign. She proved that visual evidence could generate public outrage more effectively than any written report. By 1908, the international pressure had become unbearable. The United States threatened to withdraw diplomatic recognition. European powers condemned the Belgian regime. Even Belgium's own parliament was demanding answers. The king had no choice. He sold the Congo Free State to the Belgian government, effectively ending his personal control over the territory. But here's the twisted part. Belgium paid the monarch 50 million francs as compensation for giving up his private colony. They literally rewarded him for committing genocide. The heroes who exposed the king's crimes paid a much heavier price. Roger Casement was later executed by the British government for his involvement in Irish independence movements. Edmund Morel went bankrupt and spent years in poverty. Harris suffered from severe PTSD, struggling with depression and nightmares for the rest of her life. They had won the battle against the Belgian king, but they had no idea that the war for historical truth was just beginning. Yet their victory proved something powerful: that individual moral courage, when combined with evidence and persistence, can topple even the mightiest oppressors. Because the Belgian monarch was about to commit his final crime, a cover-up so thorough, so deliberate, that it would erase the genocide from public memory for over 100 years. In August 1906, 2 years before he was forced to give up Central Africa, the Belgian king committed what may have been his most sinister act. Not mass murder. He had already perfected that. Here was something more insidious, the deliberate destruction of memory itself. The monarch ordered the burning of every document related to his African operations. For 8 consecutive days, the furnaces at the royal palace in Brussels burned at maximum capacity. Shipping manifests, administrative correspondence, military reports, financial records, personal letters between the king and his commanders, everything that could prove his direct involvement in genocide went up in smoke. Palace servants later described the scene as apocalyptic. Mountains of paper, some stacked to the ceiling, being fed continuously into multiple furnaces. The smoke was so thick that it darkened the sky over Brussels for over a week. The Belgian monarch's own words, recorded by his aide-de-camp, explain his motivation. "They have no right to know what I did there." He understood something that modern dictators are still learning. If you control the evidence, you control history. If you can destroy the documentation, you can rewrite the narrative. The document destruction was so thorough that 99% of the Congo Free State's administrative archives were lost forever. What survived was either hidden in British diplomatic files, preserved in missionary society records, or scattered among the personal papers of individual witnesses. The Belgian king had committed the perfect crime, mass murder followed by mass amnesia. But the royal cover-up was just the beginning. For the next 100 years, the Belgian establishment would maintain and expand his lies with institutional precision. From 1908 to 2010, over a full century, Belgian schools taught children that the former king was a humanitarian hero who brought civilization to Africa. History textbooks described his civilizing mission and his generous development of African infrastructure. The mass murder of millions was reduced to a footnote about unfortunate excesses by local administrators. The Royal Museum for Central Africa in Tervuren became the headquarters of historical revisionism. Until its renovation in 2018, just 6 years ago, the museum's permanent exhibitions glorified the monarch's humanitarian contributions without mentioning deliberate murder, torture, or exploitation. It wasn't accidental ignorance. Here was institutional gaslighting on a national scale. Belgian universities actively discouraged research into Central African atrocities. Professors who attempted to study the topic found their funding cut, their career prospects destroyed. Even today, in 2024, Belgium's relationship with this history remains deeply problematic. In 2020, King Philippe finally wrote a letter to the Democratic Republic of Congo, expressing his deepest regrets for colonial violence. Notice the language: regrets, not apologies. Regrets for violence, not acknowledgement of mass murder. The letter mentioned acts of violence and cruelty, but never used words like atrocities, mass murder, or crimes against humanity. It expressed sadness about suffering without acknowledging Belgian responsibility for causing that suffering. No reparations were offered, no educational reforms were announced. A 2022 survey by the University of Antwerp found that average Belgians could correctly answer only 4 out of 12 basic questions about colonial history. Despite decades of international scholarship, despite documented evidence, the Belgian public remains largely ignorant of their country's role in African atrocities. Belgian companies continue profiting from Congolese minerals. The same extraction networks established by the former king, the same transportation routes, the same corporate structures, continue operating today with minimal oversight. But something unprecedented happened just last month. On December 3, 2024, a Brussels court issued a landmark ruling in a case brought by 5 mixed-race Congolese-Belgian plaintiffs. For the first time in Belgian legal history, a court officially recognized that Belgium committed crimes against humanity in Central Africa. The ruling specifically addressed the kidnapping of mixed-race children during the colonial period. Each plaintiff was awarded £50,000 in damages. But notice the limitation. The ruling only covered mixed-race children. The murder of millions of African adults remains legally unacknowledged. The rubber quotas, the hand-cutting, the mass graves, none of that was addressed by the court. The Belgian government immediately announced its intention to appeal the decision. Even this tiny crack in the wall of denial is being fought by the Belgian establishment. But the crack exists, and sometimes that's all you need to bring down a wall that's been standing for over 100 years. Because the story doesn't end here. The pattern that the former king established, genocide plus information control equals impunity, is still operating today. The connection to your daily life is about to become uncomfortably clear. Right now, you're holding a smartphone. Inside that device is a mineral called cobalt, essential for your battery's ability to hold a charge. 60% of the world's cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and much of it is still extracted using methods that would make the former Belgian king proud. Children as young as 7 work in cobalt mines, digging tunnels with their bare hands for 12-hour shifts. They earn $2 a day. When they can't meet their quotas, they're beaten. When they try to organize for better conditions, they're arrested. The same mathematical formula that the king perfected, maximize profit, minimize human cost, control information, is still operating in the Congo today. Your iPhone, your Tesla, your laptop, they all contain minerals extracted through deliberate exploitation that traces directly back to the corporate genocide model. But the Congo is just one example. The template for combining resource extraction with information control has been replicated across the globe. The Uyghur camps in China, where over 1 million people are imprisoned to produce cotton for fast fashion brands. The deliberate starvation in Yemen, where Saudi Arabia blocks food imports while selling oil to Western nations. The ongoing atrocities in Myanmar, where Buddhist nationalism provides cover for ethnic cleansing, while international corporations extract natural gas. In every case, you see the same formula at work. Economic incentives plus private armies plus information suppression equals impunity. Here's a specific example. Glencore, one of the world's largest mining companies, operates multiple cobalt mines in the DRC using subcontractors who employ child labor. Despite international pressure, Glencore's stock price has increased 340% since 2016. Tesla, Apple, and Samsung all purchase cobalt from supply chains connected to these operations. The Democratic Republic of Congo today is the richest country in the world by natural resources and the poorest country in the world by human development. That's not a coincidence. That's the Belgian king's legacy, operating through the same extraction networks, the same transportation routes, and often the same corporate names that dominated the region 120 years ago. Which brings us to the most important lesson of this entire story. If they could hide millions of deaths for over 100 years, what else are they hiding? The suppression methods haven't changed. They've just gotten more sophisticated. Academic funding that steers research away from uncomfortable topics. Media ownership that ensures certain stories never get covered. Search algorithm manipulation that buries inconvenient information. The same Gulf oil money that funds Middle Eastern studies departments also funds fact-checking organizations and content moderation systems. The same Belgian institutional money that rewrote history textbooks now funds objective journalism training programs. Every share of this video, every comment you leave, every time you tell someone this story, you're participating in a war for information control that's been going on for over a century. Alice Seeley Harris proved that one person with a camera can topple kings. Edmund Morel proved that a shipping clerk with moral courage can expose atrocities. Roger Casement proved that individual government officials can choose justice over career advancement. You have tools that these heroes could never have imagined. You have a platform that can reach millions of people instantly. The question is, what are you going to do with that power? Today you learnt the truth that millions of people died to prove. Insala and his daughter Boali, Epondo and his severed hand, Matuli and her murdered parents, Alice Harris and her devastating photographs, Edmund Morel and his shipping records, Roger Casement and his official investigation. They didn't have voices, but you do. Here's what you can do right now. First, check your supply chains. Download the app How Good to scan products and see their ethical ratings. When you buy electronics, choose companies that have committed to conflict-free minerals. Second, support organizations fighting modern slavery. Anti-Slavery International, Free the Slaves, and the Enough Project all work directly on Congo mineral exploitation. Third, demand transparency. Contact your representatives about corporate accountability laws. Support journalism that investigates corporate crimes. Remember their names, remember their faces, remember the truth. Millions of victims, 23 years, one man's greed, and the world that chose to look away until it was too late. Don't let that happen again.